This is Lee Forster. It's time for another episode of Metal on Metal. Today we're looking at a new Standard Combat Series game that's up for pre-order, Ardennes II, a remake, in theory, of Dean Essex original Ardennes game about 30 years ago. In the early 90s that came out. We're going to talk about what you get in this package. I was involved as a playtester and have all the final version of it right now to look at. And we'll look especially at some of the changes that Dean brought into the SCS system. Now, if you've played any SCS games, you know that there is a core set of rules, but every particular game has some nuances, some changes, and that makes it fresh, gives it maybe some particular flavor for a specific battle or a campaign. And the ones we have here will have to do with zones of control, artillery, and combat, where there are some updates and changes. And then we'll talk about some of the little bulgy bits, how this fits with the bulge situation. And, you know, in Constant World and other places, people have talked about, do we need another bulge game? I don't know if we need another one, but this is a great additional bulge game. So what do you get in this? You get Dean with all his design chops in charge of this one. Carl Fung did the research for this based on the last Blitzkrieg, where they did a fantastic job putting that together. And you'll see that the maps are actually quite different here, too, than the original game, much more like the last Blitzkrieg. 2 counter sheets, 6 scenarios. Naturally, there's that campaign, which is the one that I'm usually interested in. So let's talk about some of the changes here. First of all, yes, if you're looking at the title of the screen, with incredulity perhaps, Zoc bonds make their appearance in the SCS system. This is, of course, a nod to Mark Simonich and all his games, Ukraine 43, if Stalin was a grad 42, all the different 41, 42, 43 sorts of games. And Zoc bonds are a different way of handling zones of control, or in addition to it. And so in this game, Ardennes II, there are no standard zones of control. However, there are some Zoc-like effects. One of them is a Zoc bond. And right here, we have 2 infantry units, and a Zoc bond exists, and this is much like Mark Simonich. I'm not sure how you actually say his last name, Simonich, I think. It exists between 2 units. It has to be an empty hex. Each of the units must be infantry or infantry-like. That can be parachutes, but not security, not engineers. They have to at least have 2 steps each, empty thing. And in that case, a Zoc bond exists. Usually, well, not usually, but if there's 2 options, it's the hex that's furthest away from enemy units. What happens if there's a Zoc bond? So here's some of the requirements: +4 movement points, and enemy units retreating into a Zoc bond hex stop and take a step loss. That's it. So this unit here, or say, let's go down here to the cab. There's a Zoc bond between these 2 units because they're both infantry. They both have at least 2 steps. There is not a Zoc bond here because this cab unit is not infantry. If we look over to the Germans, is there a Zoc bond in this hex? Yes, there is. There's one between these 2 units right there. But there is not one here because these are artillery. They're not infantry units, no Zoc bond there. Now, what are some of the, you're thinking you might be a little dizzy because SCS is already fluid enough. What's it going to be like without Zocs at all? If you are moving adjacently, that is, if you're maybe moving from here to here, both hexes are adjacent to an enemy unit, it's going to be a +1 to move to there. And that stacks with everything else. So there is a little bit of that. And if you start a phase adjacent to an enemy unit, you cannot overrun. And normally in SCS, that's handled by if you begin in a Zoc. But if there are no Zocs, how does that work? If you begin the turn here, maybe a German stack begins there, it cannot overrun as its first action. But that's it. So there's slightly slowing down and the Zoc bonds. But infantry gets more of a role here. And then you can realize, if you think about it, if you already play SCS games, the surround and pound tactic that's tried and true all these decades is not going to work here because you don't have Zoc bonds behind the enemy stack in order to cut them off if you're, say, advancing with armor. That fits great with a lot of the battles I read. The armor was out there exploiting. It wasn't trying to cut off retreat. So those of us who like to shoot up recon units behind the enemy lines in order to create extra losses from retreating, you're going to have to rethink your game for this one. So that's number one. Number two, artillery functions in a new way. It does not affect units, it affects hexes, and it puts barrage markers out. They're usually full barrages. We'll talk about half barrages in a minute. So I fire artillery, it puts a marker in the hex. It doesn't directly attack or DG anything. In fact, artillery doesn't have any impact on DGs. We'll get to that too. What are the effects of these barrage markers? Up to 2 barrage markers have an effect. Beyond that, you just don't place anymore. 1 enemy barrage marker adds 2 movement points to the cost to enter the hex. 2 adds +4. So you can see already they're useful in interdicting enemy movement. They also reduce the strength of enemy combat units in those hexes. That's similar to the DG effect, but if the enemy units move out, they don't carry this effect with them. It's only while they're under the barrage markers that these effects happen. There is a slight negative impact if you enter a hex of your own barrages of +1 movement point, but we assume that the people are not radioing in your location, not for friendly fire, but there is a movement cost for coordination. The artillery units themselves all have the same strength, and if you can see me, if I were doing a video, you'd see me making little quotation marks, so-called strength. They all work the same. There is not a higher chance of creating a barrage based on other artillery. That's Dean's approach, that basically if it's heavy artillery, you fire fewer shots. If it's lighter artillery, you use more munition at a higher fire rate. It all comes out to be about the same. So what you see on the counters is their range, and that is nice. A larger range artillery here with these native alpha, only a range of 4. They're actually kind of hard to use in practice. That does make a difference. So that's that. And then also artillery does not stand and defend by itself generally or at all. If an enemy unit with at least an attack factor of 2, roughly, I think I'm going by memory in this, moves next to your artillery, it must what's called bug out. You pick it up, you move it at least 8 hexes away, on a road, preferably. There's no way to cut this off. It is DG'd, so it's going to be harder to set up and use right away. And that's how that works. So you're not going to be using artillery units to defend a line at all. In fact, you're going to want to keep them back further so they're not forced to bug out, because that puts them out of action. So that's a little different too. Most important, like I just said, artillery affects hexes, not units. You can already start, if you're an SCS player, thinking, okay, how does this work in play? You're going to have to develop some new tactics to work with this. Let's take a look at the terrain effects table here. Open is pretty expensive to move in. Tracks help a lot. We'll talk about traffic jam hexes in a minute and how they are. Woods cost 6 for mech. Forest is prohibited. So you can see that this is going to force you to keep that armor on roads and on trails. Here's the enemy Zachman thing I mentioned, the moving adjacently, which I guess is a perfectly fine adverb, and then effective friendly barrages. Over here is the success for a barrage. Now the artillery has all the same strength, which is not indicated. It depends on the target hex. If I fire an artillery at an open, then on a 3 or 4, I get a half barrage, and a 5 or 6, I get a full barrage. Half barrage means I'm partly there. And at the end of all the barrages, I add up my halves. And for every full barrage I get, if I have 2 halves, I turn that into a full barrage. If I just have a half, I roll for it. 50-50, it's going to be a barrage. 50-50, it's not. That's just to give a little bit more sort of, I don't know what the word is. It's not quite as all or nothing. There is some partial effects for these things where you say, okay, these might turn into a full barrage. So that's what this means, a half, and that thing means a full. So you can see hanging out in defensive terrain helps a lot against the barrages. All right, what's different about combat? A fairly standard table. It's got maybe more columns than we're used to seeing with retreats and all that. But you have a choice as a defender to hold or retreat. You sometimes have a choice. If you decide to retreat, you retreat 5 hexes, there's no roll, the attacker advances after combat, and that's that. Oh, that's kind of nice. Can you always retreat if you want? No. Here are mandated holds. You must hold if you're DG, and that comes from being out of supply. It comes from bugging out as artillery. It comes from being disorganized from running through those traffic choke points we'll talk about in a minute. If you're under an enemy barrage marker, you must hold. So you can see already that barraging the opponent to put them in, to kind of pin them down is an important tactic. And you have to be sort of a mech movement. You can't just be leg movement here. So what that'll mean in practice is if you're close to the main contact line, it's going to be harder to retreat. But if you're in rear areas where there isn't enemy artillery support, because they haven't been able to bring the artillery up quickly enough, you'll have a lot more flexibility to retreat. You can't just retreat one hex, it's 5, but you'll actually have recon and other mobile elements delaying, the Americans delaying the Germans in the first part of the battle. Advance after combat is not quite as generous as in other SCS games. It can be a maximum of 2 hexes, normally into the hex, and then a maximum of 1 more. So with these juicy retreat 5 results, you are not exploiting 5 hexes after that. And second hex advance after combat in this game has to be along roads. It fits. That's the Ardennes. Overruns. What was I going to say about overruns in this one? There are, I'm not going to go into all the rules with that. They are a little restricted, but it's mainly the mech units too, and there aren't quite the same options for overruns as you'll find in other games. So I'll let you buy the game itself and get into details on that. A few other rules. I did talk about DG. The traffic jams, that's these hexes right here. They're surrounded in yellow. For the first 2 turns, any German unit that enters it is automatically DG, and it moves at its new half-speed movement rate, which means it may not be moving much at all. In addition, if there is a unit here, it's blocked for all other German units. So that's going to be very tricky. These hexes are all over the place on the German side of the map. So they're not going to be blowing out like everybody wants them to do in a Bulge game. It's going to take a while. It doesn't help them that they have no mech or exploitation phase in the first turn either. So the German, just like it happened historically, the initial German attack, it takes a while to develop. It's going to be a few game days. There are bridges that can be blown. That's nothing surprising. There's special rules for crossing the river for some infantry units that left their trucks behind and assaulted, all that. Fundal Hayate gets to drop, pretty much unimportant, and that's it. So we don't have special rules, no Skorzeny or whoever that was. It's all pretty straightforward. All right, so what do I like about this? It's a big game. You know, you got the 2 maps, you got 2 counter sheets. It's playable. So is it a monster? Yeah, you know, it's towards that. It's not 5 maps or anything, but it's a pretty big game. Naturally, there's scenarios that have to do on 1 map. You can play those. What's interesting to me about that, I say playable, it's SCS, which is nice. But with these new rules and with the actual bold situation, there's a lot of tactical stuff to think about. And early versions of the game had different movement point costs for stacking and were pretty fussy, as Bulge games can be. Dean got rid of all that. I think his using of these sort of these yellow, I forgot, traffic jam things, it makes it the Bulge game. And after 2 turns, you don't have to worry about it. And there aren't any fussy rules. So I did not find myself, when I played this, I did not find myself counting movement points and sitting there paralyzed by a situation, trying to figure out how to use it the best. It also helps with the new lack of zones of controls, that you're not, as the attacking player, thinking of how can I get behind the lines and surround in order to create more casualties. That whole mechanism is gone, because you can't really exploit with foot troops to get it. I guess you could try, but it's very difficult. So the enemy is not going to have their supply cut off, so you don't have any reason to throw units back there. So and I'll encourage you to get a copy so you can play with it yourself and figure out all these twists. So it is SCS. It's got some new twists to keep it interesting. Get your tactical chops up to speed for some with the different rules on the zones of control, on the Zocs and the artillery. So I think the friction of the battles is modeled well, and not in a way that I found frustrating as a player or fiddly or just sort of like a lot of work. New tactics, and it definitely feels like the Bulge. So that's my preview. It's definitely worth the risk here. I'd say go out and get yourself a copy. It's just another SCS game that have just been coming out. A lot of great situations. keeping it simple for some of us who are not 20 anymore and don't want to have to exercise our brains that much. But it does give a fresh look at the topic, a fresh look at the system, actually, too. And we'll see how many of these rules might not make their appearances in further SCS games.